For more on Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI's life and legacy, Bishop Robert Barron from the Diocese in Winona-Rochester, Minnesota, joins me now. He's also the founder of Word on Fire. Bishop, welcome.
Good to be with you. Thanks for having me.
So a big part of Pope Benedict's legacy is his work before being Pope on the Second Vatican Council back in 1962. Tell us about that.
He was one of the youngest theological experts at Vatican II. He was all of 35 years old when he started, but he had this outsized impact on the writing of the conciliar documents and then, I think, explaining the council to the wider world. And what I find really interesting about it is at Vatican II, Joseph Ratzinger would have been seen as a liberal because he was for reform in the church. He was against those conservative elements that were blocking that reform. But then let's say in the 10 years or so after the council, he became very skeptical of a Catholic progressivism that he thought was going beyond Vatican II and compromising Catholic identity. And so the liberal of the 60s becomes the conservative of the 70s, even though his own thinking really never changed. But I think that's key to him, that he was a man of Vatican II.
June 9th, 2007, I had the blessing of being the American pool correspondent who went with President George W. Bush into the Vatican. So I was there in the papal library as President Bush and Pope Benedict were meeting, and I was struck that day, and as I thought about his time as the Pope, of him succeeding John Paul II, literally a saint. What about that aspect of his time as Pope? I mean, literally replacing a legend, a saint.
I think he was very aware of the fact that he was following this world historical figure. You know, he always referred to him as John Paul the Great. And John Paul did have this enormous impact on not just the church, but the wider society. And I think Benedict knew that he himself was a much more retiring person. He was a man of books and ideas and academic. He wasn't one naturally to move, you know, with dramatic confidence on the world stage the way John Paul was. So he was aware of that. You remember, right after he was elected Pope, he said, you know, I'm just a humble worker in the vineyard of the Lord. Now, having said that, he was an enormously powerful figure, one of the great theologians of the 20th century and a great public intellectual. So he didn't have the sort of elan and dramatic flair of a John Paul II. But he was no lightweight. I mean, he was a very important cultural figure.
Bishop, he left the title of Pope. He left the post, the significant leadership role of the Catholic faith after nearly 8 years. What did that tell you about him?
Well, I think it does speak to his humility. You know, he wasn't going to cling to the office desperately. I think I'll take him at his word. He thought that physically and psychologically he was no longer up for the enormous task and burden of the papacy. And I think he said, okay, it's time for somebody else. So it does speak to his humility and his sense of, we call it detachment. You know, he was not attached to the privilege and honor of the office, but willing to let go of it. And I also think it says he returned to a life that he probably always wanted to live. My guess is that Joseph Ratzinger always wanted the life he had the last about 10 years of his life, which was in quiet meditation, contemplation, reading, writing, and prayer. So it speaks to his humility and also to, I think, his personality.
What about the aspect of Pope Francis presiding over his predecessor's funeral?
It's interesting. Of course, it hasn't happened in hundreds and hundreds of years. I'm very curious to know what he says at the funeral. You know, Francis, I was there for the canonization of John the 23rd and John Paul II, presided over by Pope Francis. And what struck a lot of us was he didn't say very much about the two saints. He talked about the gospel for the day, etc. So I'm curious. He obviously had a great affection for Benedict, visited him often, spoke of him in very warm terms. My guess is we're going to hear more about the gospel for the day than we will about the life of Benedict. But I'll be just curious to find out what he says.
Bishop Robert Barron, a pleasure to have you with us today, and really thrilled to have your perspective.
God bless you. Thanks.
God bless. Thank you.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.